You again. I thought I paid good money to make you disappear from this life for good. Harlan Voss's voice sliced across the ballroom like a blade. 200 elite guests fell silent. The clinking of crystal stopped. Even the chamber orchestra died out in the middle of a note. Maeve Donovan stood frozen on the marble floor, a tray of red wine still tilting in her hand. She recognized that face the instant he turned around the face that had haunted her worst nightmares for 6 long years. I only came here to work, Mr. Voss, she said quietly. I had no idea this was your restaurant. To work? Harlan let out a dry laugh that echoed through the hall. Still carrying trays, just like back then. Did you think I'd forget the face that trapped my son? A cheap little waitress from the slums, thinking she could latch onto the Voss name and climb her way up. A woman dripping with diamonds chuckled behind her champagne glass. Not a single person stood up. Not one opened their mouth. I never took a single dollar from you. Maeve's hand trembled, but she did not lower her head. Your check is still untouched. I don't sell myself. You didn't need to. Sweeping you out the door cost me even less than that. Harlan stepped closer, dropping his voice but making sure every word carried across the room. Look at you, worn down heels, reeking of kitchen grease. 6 years later and you're still the trash I scraped out of this life. My son could have inherited an entire empire if it weren't for you. He walked away because of you. Maeve lifted her chin. Not because of me. Harlan's face flushed crimson. He ripped the employee badge from her chest, hurled it to the floor, and ground his heel into the plastic until it shattered. Get out, now, and never let me see your face in any place that bears the Voss name again. You're fired, and so is any cook who dares to open her mouth for you. Cora Whitley came rushing out from the kitchen, but Maeve had already bent down, picked up the broken badge, straightened up, and walked toward the door with her chin held high, while the 200 most powerful people in Seattle sat and watched her go, not one of them brave enough to say a word. But no one in that ballroom that night had any idea. No one knew a black car had just rolled up to the entrance, its headlights cutting through the curtain of night rain. No one knew the man about to step out of the back seat was someone the entire West Coast underworld dared only whisper about in fear. No one knew he carried the Voss name, the name he had buried with his own hands for 6 years, and that tonight he was returning for one single reason: to swallow whole the empire of the very father who had cast him out. And absolutely no one knew that the woman Harlan Voss had just crushed beneath his heel, the poor waitress in the worn, threadbare uniform, was the very girl he was certain had vanished from his son's life forever. The empire he had built over 30 years was about to collapse in a single night, and the one who lit the fuse for all of it was none other than her. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it so it can reach even more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next unforgettable story. 8 hours before the Voss family's banquet hall sank into silence, Maeve Donovan untied the apron soaked with sweat after a long, grueling lunch shift at a small diner in the Rainier district. The kitchen was still sweltering, thick with the smell of fried onions and burned coffee. She'd been standing on those feet for 7 straight hours, carrying tray after tray of food, wiping table after table, picking up every small tip customers had left at the bottom of their cups. When the clock struck 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she gathered the day's tips, counted them silently in her head, then tucked them carefully into an old envelope with worn edges. On the envelope, in her own handwriting, was one short line that made her heart tighten a little every time she looked at it. It was the money set aside for Wesley's treatment. Her car was an old sedan, its paint faded into an ashen gray, with a dent in the passenger side door that she kept meaning to fix but never had enough money for. The engine started with a sharp rattle, then coughed a few times before finally agreeing to move. Maeve drove through the rain, wet streets of Seattle, past gleaming glass towers where people lived, lives she could only glimpse through windows, then turned into the low-rise apartment complex, where she and her younger brother rented a tiny 2-room place. The hallway smelled of damp mold, and the light bulb on the 3rd floor flickered as if it were about to die. But when she slipped the key into the lock and pushed the door open, a completely different kind of light welcomed her. By the apartment's only window, where the late afternoon sun slipped through a faded cloth curtain, Wesley was sitting in his wheelchair, a paintbrush held between fingers smeared with color. He was 19, with a bright face and eyes that always carried a mischievous spark no hardship could quite put out. On the easel before him was an unfinished painting of sunrise over Puget Sound, streaks of orange and pink stretching across the water. "You're home," he said without turning around, because he'd grown used to recognizing his sister's footsteps from the hallway. I made coffee, though I'm guessing it tastes as weak as plain water. My hands were shaking today, so I spilled half the grounds all over the place. Maeve laughed, set down her bag, and stepped up behind him. That painting is beautiful, more beautiful than the real sunrise out there. She rested a hand on his shoulder, and Wesley lifted his face to look at her with a smile only he had, the kind of smile that seemed to know nothing of bitterness. The accident when he was 14 had taken his legs from him, but it hadn't taken that laughter, and Maeve always told herself that as long as her brother could still laugh like that, she still had a reason to keep going. The doctor said there was a spinal surgery, a fragile sliver of hope that might help Wesley regain some part of his mobility. But the cost was so high that every time Maeve thought about it, dizziness washed through her. She'd been working 2 jobs at once for the past 2 years, the lunch shift at the diner and evening shifts at grand events where extra servers were hired, saving every dollar, slowly, painfully, but never giving up. "I've got a shift tonight at a really big party," she said as she changed into her server's uniform. The white blouse and black skirt washed so many times that the fabric was nearly transparent at the elbows. "The pay is 3 times the usual rate. They're opening some fancy restaurant downtown." Wesley whistled teasingly at her. "Then make sure you don't spill wine on some rich man tonight." She froze for half a second in front of the mirror, then laughed, not knowing that her brother's joke would turn cruelly true before the night was over. Before she stepped out the door, Maeve stopped in front of the mirror one last time. She lifted a hand to her collar and drew out a thin silver chain. At the end of it hung an old ring engraved with 2 initials, almost worn smooth, D.R. She touched it gently with the tip of her finger, a familiar gesture she made whenever she needed a little more courage, then carefully hid it beneath the fabric again, close against her heart. "I'll be home early," she said, kissing her brother's forehead. "Lock the door carefully." Wesley nodded, his eyes still on the painting. "You be careful too. And Maeve, no matter what happens tonight, you're still the best person I've ever known." She didn't know why he said it, but she smiled, closed the door, and walked down the dark stairwell, carrying both the burden and the faith of 2 human beings on her narrow shoulders. On the drive downtown, Maeve tried to keep her mind busy with small, practical things, silently rehearsing how to carry a tray steadily, how to pour wine without spilling a single drop, how to smile at guests who would never look at her a second time. But there was something in her chest that kept rising every time she drove past those glittering buildings, something she had buried very deep, yet had never truly died. 6 years earlier, she had been a different girl, a girl who dared to believe that love was strong enough to erase every boundary between people. Back then, she worked as a server at a small cafe near the harbor, and one rainy afternoon, a young man walked in, soaked through, ordered a cup of black coffee, then stayed until closing just so he could talk to her. He wasn't like any wealthy man she had ever met. He didn't boast. He didn't look down on her. He listened to her talk about her small dreams as though they were the most important things in the world. It took a long time before she learned that his last name was Voss, that his father owned half of the city's finest restaurants. But by the time she knew, her heart already belonged to him, and she believed his heart belonged to her too. They loved each other despite the distance between their 2 worlds, secretly, like 2 people committing a crime, because both of them understood that Harlan Voss would never accept a girl who carried plates for a living stepping into his family. There were nights when he spoke to her about a future where they would leave everything behind, where the name Voss would mean nothing anymore, where there would only be the 2 of them and a life of freedom, and she had been innocent enough to believe it. Then one day, everything collapsed in a single morning. He vanished suddenly, without a goodbye, without a phone call, as if he had never existed in her life at all. She called, and he didn't answer. She went to the place where he lived, and people told her he had gone far away. Then, a few days later, a man in a polished suit came to the place where she worked, placed a check on the table with a number so large she had to count the digits again and again, and left with it a cold, typed note, saying that the Voss family hoped she would quietly remove herself from their son's life, that this was money for her to start over, somewhere very far away. In that moment, something inside her shattered beyond repair. She understood that in the eyes of those people, she had never been a person at all. She was only a stain that needed to be wiped away, an inconvenience that could be bought off with money. She stood there for a long time, looking at the check as if she were looking at a knife buried in her chest. And then she did something people like Harlan Voss would never have expected. She pushed the check back and refused to take even a single cent. because she knew that if she accepted that money, then they would have been right, that she could be bought, that her dignity had a price, and she would rather starve than let them be right. She was certain that the man she had once loved had chosen his family, chosen the empire, chosen the name, and had cast her aside the way people threw away something that no longer had value. That bitter belief followed her through 6 long years. From that day on, she never told anyone about her past. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had decided to rebuild her life entirely with her own 2 hands, owing no one anything, begging for no one's pity. She raised her younger brother. She carried every bill. She waited tables through thousands of shifts, and each time she became so exhausted she thought she might collapse, she reached up to touch the silver ring hidden beneath her collar and reminded herself that she was far stronger than people believed her to be. When her car turned onto the road leading to the newly opened restaurant, radiant with lights and flowers, Maeve drew in a deep breath, straightened her collar, and stepped out, completely unaware that fate had arranged for her to face, tonight, the very face that had once pushed her into the abyss. While Maeve was stepping into the Voss family's banquet hall on this side of the city, on the other side, inside an old warehouse near the south waterfront of Seattle, another man was quietly deciding the fate of someone who had just made the greatest mistake of his life. People called him Luke Rabetti, a name that didn't appear on any birth certificate, a name he had chosen for himself from the day he decided to bury his past and build an empire of his own from nothing. He was 34 years old, tall and hard-bodied, wearing a dark tailored suit cut to fit every line of him precisely, and on his left cheekbone was a faint scar, a mark left from those first years when he had nothing but his bare hands and a hatred that burned low and steady beneath the skin. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to swing his fists. Real power never needs to scream. It only needs to be present, and when Luke Rabetti entered a room, the air inside that room thickened all by itself. Tonight, the man kneeling before him was a man named Dwyer, the owner of a chain of pawnshops that doubled as loan shark operations in the eastern working-class district, a man who specialized in driving poor families to the edge and then seizing whatever little they had left. Last week, he had thrown a single mother and her 2 children out of the only home they had in the middle of the rain, all because of a debt whose interest he had multiplied by 10 on his own. That woman happened to be the wife of a man who had once worked under Luke, and the news had reached him within 1 day. "Do you know why I called you here?" Luke asked, his voice low and even, without a trace of anger. And it was precisely that calmness that made Dwyer tremble violently. I didn't do anything wrong. I was only collecting what I was owed," the man stammered. Luke tilted his head slightly, and one of the men standing behind him placed a thick file on the table. Inside it were names, one after another, every family Dwyer had pushed into misery over the years. "Your money," Luke repeated, turning the pages slowly. "You built your entire fortune on the tears of people who had nothing left to lose. You thought that because they were weak, they deserved it." The whole warehouse fell utterly silent. The men standing around them all lowered their eyes, and not one of them dared to breathe too loudly, because every one of them knew one thing very clearly. In Luke Rabetti's world, there was one law that could never be broken, and that was never to use strength to crush the weak. He could be chillingly ruthless toward those who deserved it, but he had never touched an innocent person, and that was exactly what made the men under him both fear and respect him, in a way money could never buy. "Starting tonight," Luke said, closing the file with a dry, hard sound, "every debt in your book is erased. You'll return that house to that family, along with enough money for them to live decently for 1 year, and you'll disappear from this city before sunrise, because if I hear your name one more time, no one will ever have to search for you again." Dwyer opened his mouth, about to beg, but Luke's eyes stopped every word in his throat, eyes as still as the surface of a frozen lake, with a bottomless abyss beneath them. When Dwyer was led outside, an older man, Luke's longtime right hand, stepped closer and said quietly that everything was ready for tonight's plan. Luke nodded, looking out through the warehouse window, where the rain was lashing in waves against the black surface of the bay. For the past 6 years, he had built all of this not only for power, but for one single purpose he had never spoken of to anyone. And tonight, at last, the day he had been waiting for had arrived. "Get the car ready," he said softly, draping his overcoat over his shoulders. "It's time I paid my father a visit." No one in the room dared to ask him a single question, because they could all feel that behind those few quiet words was a storm that had been compressed for many years, and tonight it was about to be set free. The car rolled through the rain toward downtown, and in the dark cabin, Luke leaned his head back, letting the water-blurred streets drift past the window, and with them, an entire past he thought he had buried, though in truth it had never stopped bleeding. 6 years earlier, he hadn't been Luke Rabetti. He had been the eldest son of Harlan Voss, the expected heir to a restaurant empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a young man who believed he could keep both the Voss bloodline and the girl he loved. He had been wrong. On that fateful night, when he stood before his father in the oak-paneled study of the mansion and declared clearly that he would marry the waitress he had secretly loved, he had thought the worst that could happen would be a few angry shouts. But Harlan Voss didn't shout. He only looked at him with the cold eyes of a man weighing profit against loss, then told him in an even voice that if he dared walk out that door for a serving girl, he would leave with nothing, not a single cent, not a name, not one thing that belonged to the Voss family. He had thought it was only a threat, until his father truly did exactly that. Within just a few days, his accounts were frozen, his name was removed from every company document, and the people who had once bowed their heads and called him young master now looked at him as if he were a stranger. But what broke him wasn't the loss of money or status. It was what happened right after, when he went looking for the girl he loved, with his last shred of hope, only to discover that she had left, vanished without leaving a single trace. People told him she had accepted a large sum of money from his family and quietly gone away to find a new life. And in the absolute despair of a man who had just lost everything, he believed it. He believed that the girl he had been ready to give up his entire inheritance for was just someone who could be bought like everyone else. That shattered belief cut deeper than even his father's rejection, and it turned the trusting young man he had once been into someone completely different, cold, suspicious, and hard as stone. He wandered through the darkest streets of the city, sleeping in places no one cared to look at, and in those black days, a man from the underworld saw something in his eyes, a flame that hadn't gone out, and reached out a hand to him. From the bottom of that abyss, he rose one step at a time, learning how to survive in a world where kindness was weakness and weakness was a fatal wound, and he climbed, slowly but unstoppably, until the name Luke Rabetti became a name the entire West Coast had to fear. Through all those years, he hadn't forgotten for even one day the face of the father who had thrown him away, and he had waited in silence, patient as a wolf waiting for its prey to grow exhausted, until this exact moment, because the Voss empire was no longer as solid as it had once been. Bad investments, hidden debts, partners beginning to doubt, all of it had made it more fragile than ever before, and Luke had quietly gathered every fragment of power, every share, every weakness of it into the palm of his hand. Tonight, he was returning not to beg for forgiveness, and not to heal what had been broken, but to finish what he had started long ago, to let the father who had once declared he was nothing see with his own eyes the very son he had cast aside, tightening his grip around the throat of the empire he valued more than blood. Luke thought his heart had turned completely to stone, that there was nothing left in this world capable of shaking him anymore, but he couldn't have known that in only a few minutes, when he crossed the threshold of the Voss family's banquet hall, fate would set before his eyes something he had kept buried for 6 long years, and all his cold calculations would shatter in a single instant. When Luke's leather shoes touched the marble steps leading into the banquet hall, he immediately sensed that something had just happened in the air, an unusually heavy silence, the kind of silence left behind after a storm, as though the entire room had witnessed something that made everyone hold their breath, yet no one dared to name it. He paid it no mind, because his thoughts were fixed entirely on the moment he had waited for through 6 long years. The great doors opened, and Luke stepped into a sea of golden light from the crystal chandeliers, slowly, calmly, each footstep ringing against the stone floor like the countdown of a clock no one could stop. The first person to recognize him was an old businessman standing near the entrance, and the glass in the man's hand froze in midair. Then, like a wave spreading outward, face after face turned toward him, panicked whispers passing from one person to another, because in this narrow world of wealth and status, there wasn't a single person who didn't know the name Luke Rabetti, and there wasn't a single person who had ever imagined the day would come when he would walk, of his own accord, into a room filled with lights like this. At the far end of the hall, Harlan Voss was raising his glass in a toast with a group of powerful guests, still wearing the triumphant look of a man who had just confirmed his authority before a crowd. But when he turned and caught sight of the man walking toward him, the wineglass in his hand almost slipped from his fingers, and all the blood drained cleanly from his face, leaving behind the ashen pallor of a terror he couldn't hide in time. 6 years had passed, but he recognized the son he had once driven away at once. Even though that son had changed so much, he was almost another man now, taller, colder, carrying a kind of power that made even Harlan feel a chill crawl through him. "Hello, Father," Luke said, stopping a few steps away from him, his voice gentle, yet clear enough for the people around them to hear those 2 words and immediately stare with their mouths open. "It's been a long time. The party is magnificent." Harlan tried to steady himself, forcing a crooked smile onto his face, his eyes flicking quickly around the room, as if to make sure the guests were still watching, because to him, keeping his pride intact before these people mattered more than the truth itself. "I don't remember inviting you," he said, lowering his voice in threat. "You have no right to step in here." Luke's mouth curved faintly, a smile that never touched his eyes. "Right," he repeated, letting his gaze move across the grand room, the stone-clad walls, the expensive wine service, the breathless faces. "You've always valued your rights, haven't you? The right to decide who is worthy and who isn't. The right to throw away anything that gets in your way. I learned a great deal from you about that kind of right." Every word he spoke was composed, without a trace of strain, but that calmness made each sentence cut coldly as a blade, and Harlan felt the ground beneath his feet begin to sway. "What did you come here for?" Harlan asked, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "If you think that after all these years you can come back and demand something, then you're badly mistaken. You have nothing left here." Luke stepped 1 pace closer, and the whole room seemed to shrink with that single movement. "You're right," he answered softly. "I didn't come back to reclaim anything you once gave me. I came back for a completely different reason, and you'll understand what it is soon enough." In that moment, between father and son, stood an abyss of 6 years, filled with hatred and all the things that had never been spoken. While the crowd of guests gathered around them like silent ghosts, no one daring to move, no one daring to look away, Harlan opened his mouth to continue. But right then, Luke's gaze accidentally swept past his shoulder toward the long row of glass doors leading out to the foyer, where a slender figure in a server's uniform was walking farther away beneath the rain, and something at the corner of his eyes suddenly stilled. A vague sensation he himself hadn't yet had time to understand, as though some invisible thread had just trembled softly inside his chest, after all those years of sleep. There was something in the way the woman beyond the rain walked that made Luke unable to look away, something so familiar it tightened his chest, though even he didn't understand why. And in the instant, she turned her head slightly, to glance back at the banquet hall one last time before walking on. The light from the crystal chandeliers spilled through the glass doors and fell perfectly upon her face. Even from a distance, Luke recognized that unforgettable silhouette and the sharp ache of a profile he had memorized for years. Luke stood frozen. The world around him, the crowd of guests, his father's bloodless face, the frightened whispers, all of it suddenly dissolved into a distant humming noise, because he recognized her. He would have recognized her anywhere in this world, whether 6 years or 60 years had passed. His mind instantly flashed to the silver ring she always wore close to her heart, the one engraved with 2 initials, a keepsake from her mother that he had once promised to replace. A name he had forced himself not to speak for 6 long years suddenly broke open inside his chest. It was impossible. The woman in the worn server's uniform walking farther and farther away, the woman who, only minutes earlier, had been trampled without mercy by his own father in the middle of this room, was her. And with that recognition, another question immediately rose up, tearing through the layer of ice he had spent 6 years packing around his heart. If she truly had betrayed him, if she truly had taken his family's money and turned her back on him to begin a richer, easier life, then why, after all these years, was she still wearing the faded uniform of a poor server, still carrying trays of wine at other people's parties? And why? Why did she still keep that ring with her, pressed close to her heart, the one keepsake he knew she treasured more than life itself? Someone who had sold out love for money would never have kept the only thing that reminded her of that love. The entire story he had believed for 6 years, the whole foundation of hatred that had shaped him into the man he was today, suddenly cracked in a single instant, and a terrible doubt began to creep into his mind, a possibility that, if it were true, would overturn everything he had ever believed. Harlan, standing across from him, saw the sudden change on his son's face, and he followed Luke's gaze toward the glass doors. For one brief moment, he too went pale when he understood who Luke was looking at. "Luke," he called, his voice abruptly stripped of its arrogance and laced with a panic he couldn't quite hide. "You don't need to concern yourself with that thing. She's not worth your—" But Luke no longer heard anything. He didn't bother letting his father finish. He didn't bother looking back at the crowd watching him. He didn't bother thinking about the empire he had spent 6 years surrounding, and that now lay within his grasp. All of those things, in this moment, became meaningless. He turned, brushed past a stunned waiter, and began to walk, then stride, then almost run across the glittering banquet hall toward the great doors, ignoring the hundreds of astonished eyes following him from behind, ignoring his father's desperate voice calling after him. The doors flew open, and a cold gust carrying the breath of rain struck him full in the face as he rushed out onto the marble steps, his eyes frantically sweeping over the dark courtyard shining with water, searching for one slender figure in the pouring rain. The heart he had long believed had turned to stone was now hammering wildly in his chest, as though it might burst. And for the first time in 6 endless years, the man the entire West Coast feared felt fragile and frightened like a boy, terrified that if he was even 1 second too late, he would lose her again, and this time forever. Maeve had almost reached her old car at the far end of the parking lot when she heard hurried footsteps running behind her, shoes striking the wet, shining pavement, and she tightened her grip on the bag in her hand, thinking someone had been sent out to drive her away one last time, just to satisfy their cruelty. She spun around, ready to face them, but the words hadn't even reached her lips before they froze in her throat when she saw the man standing a few steps away from her in the rain, breathing hard, his soaked hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes fixed on her as though he had just seen a ghost. She didn't recognize him right away, because the man before her wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the distant air of someone powerful, nothing like the young man in her memory. But then the yellow light from the street lamp spilled across him, revealing the faint scar on his left cheekbone and something in those eyes, a look she had once known by heart, and her breath caught. "No," she whispered, taking one step back, shaking her head again and again, as if trying to deny what her eyes were seeing. "It can't be. You left me, Maeve." He only said her name, a name he had forced himself not to remember for 6 years, and the very sound of it breaking from his lips made them both tremble. "I never left you. Not for a single day." She let out a laugh, bitter and threaded with tears, rainwater and tears mingling as they ran down her face. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice breaking. "You disappeared without a word. They brought money to the place where I worked and told me to get out of your life. You chose the Voss name. You chose your fortune. And you let me believe I wasn't worth staying for." Every word she spoke was like a knife. But to Luke, they weren't accusations. They were the final pieces of a terrible picture he had never seen whole in all these 6 years. And as he fitted them together with what he had once been told, a horrifying truth began to emerge. "Maeve, listen to me," he said, stepping closer, his voice urgent and shaking, his hands gripping her shoulders as though he were afraid she might vanish. "I didn't leave. My father threw me out of the house the very night I told him I wanted to marry you. He took everything from me, not 1 cent, not one name, and when I came back to look for you, they told me you had taken money from my family and left to find a better life. I believed it, Maeve. For 6 years, I believed you were the one who betrayed me." Maeve stood frozen, her eyes wide, and the pieces inside her own mind began locking into place in a way that filled her with horror, because she knew clearly that she had never taken a single dollar, that she had pushed that check back with all the dignity she had left. "I never took their money," she said, her voice almost without breath. "I gave the check back. I would rather have starved than sell myself." "They told you I took the money?" And then they both fell silent, standing in the pouring rain, as the naked truth finally exposed itself before them. For 6 years, they had both lived inside a lie carefully staged by the same man. Harlan Voss had not only torn them apart, he had poisoned them both with opposite stories, making Luke believe she was the betrayer, making her believe he was the one who had abandoned her, making certain that no matter what happened, the two of them would never find their way back to each other. 6 years of loneliness, 6 years of hatred, 6 years of 2 broken hearts, all because of the ruthless pride of a man who could never accept that his son had fallen in love with a girl who carried plates for a living. "Dear God," Luke whispered, his forehead resting against hers, his shoulders trembling, and for the first time in so many years, that hardened man could not hold back the tears that mingled with the rain. "All those years, everything we lost, all because of him." Maeve took his hand, the hand she had once thought she would never touch again. And in the freezing rain of Seattle, two people who had once been torn from each other finally found one another again, not in the intoxication of happiness, but in the shared pain of two victims who had just realized they had been deceived for an entire stretch of their lives. The rain gradually began to ease, but the cold reality did not release Maeve, because when the surge of emotion from that fateful meeting settled, she still had to face one naked truth nothing could erase. She had just lost the job that brought her the best income she had, and tonight she was going home empty-handed, with a broken employee badge and nothing else. All the way back to the apartment, the numbers spun wildly in her head. Next month's rent, the overdue utility bills, and most frightening of all, the thin envelope she still kept hidden in a drawer, the place where she had gathered every dollar for Wesley's treatment. She had calculated everything so carefully. If she could work just a few more months at the pay rate from grand parties like tonight, she would have enough for the deposit on the surgery. But now, when the doors of every restaurant carrying the Voss name had slammed shut in front of her, and when Harlan had more than enough influence to make sure no one in this world would dare hire her again, she felt the ground beneath her feet collapsing piece by piece. Luke had followed her all the way back to the apartment complex, and when she got out, he stepped out of his black car too, standing beneath the sickly yellow streetlight, his face filled with all the things he wanted to say. "Maeve," he called. His voice returned to its usual steadiness, though his eyes couldn't hide the ache inside him. "I know what you're thinking. I know what you lost tonight. Let me take care of it. The money for your brother's surgery, however much it is, means nothing to me. I can transfer it to you first thing tomorrow morning, and you'll never have to worry about money for another day in your life." It was an offer that came from the bottom of his heart, without a trace of calculation, and Maeve understood that. She understood that this man was willing to lay his entire fortune at her feet without hesitation, but that was exactly why she had to shake her head. "No, Luke," she said softly, but her voice was firm. "I can't accept it." He frowned and stepped closer. "Why not? This isn't charity, Maeve. This is me, the person who—" "That's exactly why I can't," she interrupted, and her eyes shone with a hard light forged by 6 years of hardship. "Do you know what kept me standing all these 6 years? It was knowing that everything I had, no matter how little, was made by my own hands. I never took a single dollar from your family. Not when I was hungry, not when I was desperate. If I take your money now to heal Wesley, then I'll lose the only thing I've never let anyone take from me. I don't want to love you from the place of someone who owes you. I want to stand beside you as an equal, or not at all." Luke stood silent, and in that moment, he realized that the girl before him was no longer the young, innocent server he had once known, but a woman whose self-respect was as solid as bedrock, and that very thing left him heartbroken, and admiring her so deeply that he could not speak. He wanted to argue, wanted to persuade her, wanted to tell her that she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore, but he understood that if he forced her, he would only wound the very dignity that had helped her survive all these years. "All right," he finally said, though each word seemed trapped in his throat. "I won't force you. But Maeve, promise me one thing, that you won't try to fight everything alone anymore, because I'm here now." She nodded, a tired nod, then walked into the building, leaving him standing alone beneath the light. When she opened the apartment door, Wesley was still awake, sitting by the easel, and he looked up at his sister with worried eyes, because he knew, just by looking at her face, that something had gone wrong tonight, no matter how hard she tried to smile and hide it. While Luke drove back to his mansion, with his mind tangled in everything that had just come to light, somewhere else in the city, inside a sealed room, under dim lights, the man he had once trusted most was sitting across from his greatest enemy. His name was Royce Bellamy, Luke's longtime right hand, the man who had stood beside him from the earliest days of building his empire, the man Luke had entrusted with the organization's most important secrets without the slightest suspicion. But Royce's loyalty, as it turned out, had never been as solid as Luke believed, because for years, he had quietly fed a bitterness that grew larger and larger, feeling that he would forever remain the shadow standing behind another man, doing all the dirtiest work but never once being allowed to sit in the first chair. And now, when he realized that his cold, untouchable leader had suddenly revealed a fatal weakness, a woman, he understood that the chance he had been waiting for so long had finally arrived. "You said my son is distracted," Harlan Voss said, his sharp, icy eyes drilling into the man seated across from him, still not fully trusting the one who had come to him. "I need more than empty words. I spent 6 years keeping that boy away from everything that belongs to me, and tonight he walked straight into my house as if he owned the whole world." Royce curled his mouth into a smile and pushed a thin file toward him. "You don't understand what your son has become over these 6 years, Mr. Voss. He isn't the precious heir you once threw out the door anymore. He holds half the freight ports and distribution network of the entire West Coast in his hands, and more importantly, he has quietly gathered nearly enough shares to strangle your restaurant empire whenever he chooses. If you still want to save what you have, then you and I need each other." It was an alliance formed from 2 different motives, but aimed at the same goal. Harlan wanted to save his wavering empire and crush the son he now saw as a threat, while Royce wanted to push Luke aside and seize the entire underground kingdom he had coveted for so long. Their plan was intricate and cold. Royce would use his trusted position to gradually redirect the loyalty of Luke's men, plant suspicion, divide the organization from within, and at the same time feed Harlan information about the weak points in Luke's network, so the old man could use his connections and money to strike precisely where it would hurt most. "And then there's the woman," Royce continued, lowering his voice with calculated intent. "She is his softest thread. A man like Luke can endure any attack aimed at himself, but touch someone he cares about, and he'll lose all reason. And a man without reason is very easy to make mistakes." Harlan stayed silent for a long while, his fingers tapping evenly against the polished wooden tabletop, while inside his mind, a dark plan slowly began to take shape. He already hated Maeve down to the marrow of his bones, and now that he knew she wasn't only a stain from the past, but also his son's vulnerable point in the present, he realized she could become the most useful weapon in his hand. "Fine," he said at last, his thin lips lifting into a smile that seemed to chill the room by a few degrees. "You handle the inside of his organization. As for that girl, leave her to me. I know exactly what to do to make her life collapse, and when he rushes in to save her, that will be when he leaves himself exposed." The 2 men shook hands in the darkness, a handshake without a trace of trust, nothing but the pure collusion of greed and hatred, and neither one of them realized that the very contempt they held for that woman, the belief that she was only a fragile weakness easily exploited, was the first fatal mistake in their entire plan. Because they didn't know that Maeve Donovan, poor and alone as she was, possessed a kind of strength that neither money nor underground power could ever subdue. Harlan Voss was not the kind of man who sat still and waited, and within 3 days, he had begun tightening the vice around the woman he saw as his son's weakness, with a cold cruelty sharpened over 30 years in business. The first blow fell on Maeve when she went to other restaurants and hotels throughout the city to look for work, because everywhere she went, she received the same cool shake of the head, the same evasive eyes, and it wasn't until the 5th place that she understood what was happening. When a manager who had once known her pulled her into a corner and quietly told her that word had spread through the entire industry, saying she was a thief who stole tips and caused trouble, and that anyone who hired her would have to face pressure from the Voss Corporation. She stood frozen in the middle of the street, understanding that Harlan had not only driven her out of his restaurant, but was deliberately sealing off every road by which she could earn a living, pushing her against a wall until she had no way left to stand on her own feet. But Harlan did not stop there. He knew very well that a resilient woman like Maeve wouldn't collapse easily just because she had lost her job, so he aimed at the things she loved most. Cora Whitley, the head chef who had dared to stand up for her at the banquet, and had been fired along with her, suddenly began receiving threatening calls, warning that if she continued to contact or help Maeve, not only would her career vanish, but the retirement savings she had spent her whole life building would also dissolve into smoke. Cora, with all her courage, called Maeve and said she would never abandon her, but Maeve heard the fear the older woman was trying to hide in her voice, and her heart twisted when she realized that simply because Cora had stood on her side, a decent person now had to suffer such cowardly revenge. Yet the blow that truly staggered Maeve, the blow aimed straight at her heart, came one afternoon when she received a call from the hospital where Wesley was being monitored in preparation for his surgery. They informed her in a polite but firm voice that the top surgeon, who had already agreed to take Wesley's case, had suddenly withdrawn, that Wesley had been moved to the very bottom of the waiting list, and that under the current circumstances, the surgery could be postponed indefinitely without any clear explanation. Maeve gripped the phone tightly in her hand, feeling the whole world collapse onto her shoulders, because she understood at once that this wasn't a coincidence, but Harlan Voss's hand reaching all the way into the hospital corridors, using his connections and his money to steal the last ray of hope from her younger brother. A 19-year-old young man who had never harmed anyone, all to punish the sister who had dared to love his son. That night, when Maeve returned to the apartment, she stood outside the door for a very long time, drying the tears on her face and drawing deep breaths, because she did not allow herself to bring that despair into the home, did not allow Wesley to see his sister break down. When she stepped inside, he was sitting beside his easel as always, and he looked up at her with a smile, innocently telling her about the new painting he was planning, completely unaware of the storm closing in around them both. Maeve sat down beside him, took his paint-stained hand in hers, and answered him with a gentle smile. But deep inside her, something was slowly changing, because the fear and despair that had first swallowed her were gradually giving way to another fire, quiet but fierce. She realized that if she simply sat still and endured, Harlan Voss would crush not only her, but also the people she loved, and for the first time in many days, she was no longer thinking about how to survive. She was beginning to think about how to fight back. The next morning, instead of continuing to knock on restaurant doors for a job she knew would never come, Maeve called Cora and arranged to meet her at a small, hidden-away cafe, a place where no one from the Voss world ever set foot. When the older woman sat down across from her with worry written all over her face, Maeve spoke to her in a calm but firm voice that even surprised Cora. "I'm not going to hide anymore, Cora," she said, both hands wrapped around the hot cup of coffee. "For 6 years, I lowered my head, endured, and believed that if I just lived honestly and worked hard, no one could hurt me. But I was wrong. Men like Harlan Voss will never leave me alone unless I give him a reason to stop." Cora looked at the girl she had come to think of as a daughter over the years, and in those eyes, she recognized a change. The girl who had once only known how to endure was now ready to straighten her back and fight. Maeve understood that she could not defeat an empire with money or power, because she had neither. But she had something Harlan had looked down on for years, and that was the truth. And that truth lived inside the memories of the very people he had once trampled. Through many years of working in the restaurant world, Maeve had known dozens of servers, cooks, and cleaners who had once worked for Voss Corporation establishments. And she knew very well that behind the glittering beauty of those grand banquet halls were countless bitter stories kept hidden: stolen wages, unpaid overtime, workers fired without cause when they dared to speak up. Together with Cora, who knew almost everyone in the industry, Maeve began quietly seeking them out one by one, sitting with them and listening as they told her what they had endured, and more importantly, convincing them that it was time for those stories to be brought into the light. At first, most of them refused out of fear, because the Voss name still held too much power, and everyone was afraid that if they spoke out, they would be crushed, just like those who had dared resist before them. But Maeve didn't give up. She returned patiently. This time not to beg, but to show them that she had lost everything just as they had, that she had nothing left to fear, and that if they stood together, the voices of many people would become something even Harlan Voss couldn't silence. Gradually, one by one, they began to trust her. One by one, they began handing her what they had kept: old pay stubs with false amounts recorded, threatening messages from managers, documents proving that funds had been misreported to evade taxes, and within 2 weeks, the small table in her cramped apartment was piled high, with a file powerful enough to shake an entire empire. One evening, while Maeve was bent over the documents beneath the yellow light, carefully sorting them, Luke came to visit her, and he stood silently in the doorway for a long while, watching the woman he loved fighting tirelessly in her own way, not with violence or authority, but with courage and endurance. "You know I could resolve this much faster," he said softly, a faint smile passing over his lips. "I know," she replied, lifting her eyes to him. "But if you do it for me, then it's your victory, not theirs. These people need to claim justice for themselves, Luke. They need to know their voices carry weight." Luke stepped forward, sat down beside her, and for the first time in many years, he felt a strange warmth slipping into his chest, because he realized that this woman did not need him to rescue her. She only needed him to stand beside her, and that made him love her more than anything else ever could. "Then," he said, placing his hand on the stack of files. "Let me help you make that voice carry farther. I know exactly who needs to hear it." And in the warm light of that small apartment, two people who had once been torn apart by schemes and lies now sat side by side, not as the strong and the weak, but as true companions, preparing together for the battle ahead. What Royce Bellamy did not know, when he sat in the darkness and shook hands with Harlan, was that Luc Rabetti had smelled betrayal long before, because a man who had climbed to the very top of the underworld as he had could never have survived without the instinct to know when a knife was being sharpened behind his back. For weeks, he had watched in silence, letting Royce believe he was gaining the upper hand, letting him confidently leak each piece of information to Harlan, while Luc himself quietly laid a trap Royce would never see coming. He had men follow every meeting Royce attended, record every phone call, every money transfer, every promise Royce exchanged with Harlan's people, and slowly gather enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. Luc understood that the heaviest punishment for a traitor was not to strike him or spill his blood, but to let him witness with his own eyes the entire kingdom he coveted turn to ash right in the palm of his hand. One evening, Luc summoned every head of his organization to the old warehouse by the waterfront, the place that had already witnessed so many decisions that determined human lives, and when Royce walked in with his usual confidence, he had no idea that tonight would be the night of his ruin. Luc sat at the head of the room, calm as always, and then he began to speak, not loudly, not accusingly, but simply placing each file of evidence on the table, one recording after another, letting Royce's own voice echo through the dead, silent room, exposing all of his betrayal in front of every man who had once considered him a brother. Royce's face grew paler with each recording, and when he tried to struggle and justify himself, no one in that room stood with him, because in this world, a man who betrayed his leader to join hands with the enemy had no refuge left anywhere. "I gave you everything," Luc said, his voice low and cold as ice. "Trust, position, respect, and you sold it to the very man who once threw me away. You won't suffer a single wound by my hand, but from this moment on, you have nothing left. No money, no power, and no one on this earth who dares stand on the same side as you. You will live the rest of your life understanding that this is the heaviest punishment of all." When Royce was led outside, reduced to a man with empty hands and rejected by the entire underworld, Luc turned to the second battlefield, the one he had been preparing for through 6 long years, his father's empire. With Royce removed and the internal network once again firmly in his hands, Luc began tightening the financial vice around the Voss Corporation with cold precision. He activated every share he had quietly gathered over the years through a string of front companies. He approached Harlan's largest creditors and bought up those debts, turning himself into the true creditor standing behind the entire restaurant empire that had once seemed so solid. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He only needed to make perfect financial moves, one after another, until Harlan Voss suddenly realized that his cash flow was being strangled from every direction, without being able to understand why. Major partners began receiving carefully placed calls. Banks unexpectedly tightened the credit limits they had once kept loose, and the investments Harlan had been counting on to save the situation withdrew one by one without explanation. The empire he had spent 30 years building, already cracked from within by his own greed and miscalculations, now began to shake violently under the invisible but irresistible pressure of the sun he had once believed had been erased forever. And what made it all perfect? What made Luc sit silently by the window overlooking the dark bay with the faintest smile passing over his lips was that Harlan had not yet even realized that the hand choking him was the hand of the child he had cast aside, and that at the very same time, somewhere else in the city, the woman he had looked down on most was also quietly preparing to strike him with a blow he would never see coming. The first blow came on a Monday morning, when the file that Maeve, Cora, and dozens of former employees had worked so hard to gather was placed directly in the hands of a team of investigative reporters from the city's largest newspaper. And within just a few hours, the story of the Voss Corporation spread everywhere, like fire meeting wind. The headlines struck the public full in the face, exposing a glittering restaurant empire built on the backs of workers who had been cheated out of wages, forced to work until they were exhausted, and fired without mercy when they dared speak up for their rights. The testimonies of real people, each with a name and a face, carried a weight no public relations campaign of Harlan's could silence, because people no longer saw a luxurious corporation. They saw single mothers pushed into the street, older men robbed of their retirement money, flesh and blood human beings crushed beneath the heel of greed. Immediately afterward, the authorities, who had long been quietly watching the irregularities in the Voss Corporation's books, stepped in, and evidence of misreported funds used to evade taxes, falsified payroll records, and shady transactions hidden for years was dragged into the light, one piece at a time. An official investigation into labor law violations was opened, followed by a large-scale tax audit, and groups of people carrying search warrants began appearing at the corporation's headquarters in broad daylight, right in front of the cameras of dozens of reporters waiting outside. Images of sealed boxes of documents being carried out of the Voss family's elegant glass building were broadcast across every news channel. And after only one night, a name that had once symbolized luxury and power suddenly became synonymous with lies and exploitation. On the trading floor, the consequences came even faster and more brutally. The shares of the Voss Corporation, which Luke had already been quietly weakening from within, now plunged without restraint as one piece of bad news after another came crashing down, and within just a few trading sessions, more than half of their value had evaporated, dragging hundreds of millions of dollars of Harlan's wealth with it. Business partners who had once competed for the chance to shake his hand now turned away one after another, hurriedly withdrawing from every agreement to avoid being pulled down with him. Invitations to elite events suddenly stopped altogether, and people who had once bowed their heads to greet him with respect now avoided him, as if he carried a disease. The empire Harlan had placed above his own blood began cracking from every side, and for the first time in 30 years, the man who had always held absolute control felt everything slipping out of his hands at a dizzying speed. In the oak-paneled study of the mansion, the very place where, 6 years earlier, he had coldly declared that he was disowning his son, Harlan sat among stacks of papers and phone calls that would not stop ringing, his face visibly hollowed out, and a panic he had never known before began creeping into every fiber of his body. He called Royce, searching for a way to respond, but the line only rang with hopeless tones, because his ally had vanished without a trace, crushed by the very man they had both conspired to destroy. He tried to follow the trail of the invisible force choking him, but the more he searched, the more he found only a maze of front companies leading into nothing, and he could not understand who that hidden enemy could be, who could possibly have enough power and patience to drive him into a corner so perfectly. He did not know that the answer to all those questions was standing right outside his door, and that in only a few days, the full truth about the person who had pulled his empire down would be exposed, a truth even more bitter than the collapse itself. The final blow, the blow that brought Harlan Voss down completely, not only in wealth but in honor, came from a place he never would have expected, from the very woman who had stood beside him for 35 years. Eleanor Voss, the wife he had always regarded as a silent ornament meant to polish his perfect image, a woman he assumed had grown far too accustomed to lowering her head and looking away from everything he did, turned out to be the one who held his darkest secrets, and she chose the exact moment when his empire began to tremble to finally raise her voice. For years, Eleanor had lived in endurance. She had watched her husband trample countless people. She had quietly carried inside her the guilt of the son he had driven away, the son she herself had been too cowardly to protect back then. And now, when she saw a chance to atone for her mistake, she decided not to remain silent for even one more second. Eleanor went to meet with investigators and reporters, bringing with her not only testimony, but also documents she had secretly kept for years, and she exposed to the public a truth even more shocking than the tax and labor scandals. She told them how Harlan had staged the entire scheme to tear his son away from the girl he loved, how he had hired someone to bring the check and falsely accused that girl of taking money and leaving, and how he had fabricated the opposite story to poison his son's mind, turning two people who loved each other into two bitter enemies for 6 years, all to protect the so-called honor of the Voss family name. She said she had witnessed all of it in silence, and that the shame of her own cowardice had followed her night after night, until she could no longer bear it. When this story was made public, it transformed Harlan Voss from a fallen businessman into a man despised by society, because people might forgive someone who had failed in business, but no one could tolerate a father willing to destroy the life of his own flesh and blood simply because of his tyrannical pride. Eleanor's testimony did more than expose his true nature before millions of people. It also ignited a wave of new lawsuits, as other victims he had once pressured in the past now found the courage to stand up and demand justice, strengthened by the example of a woman who dared turn away from her own husband to defend what was right. And amid that storm of public outrage, people began whispering about a name, about the son who had been cast out all those years ago and had now returned like an invisible force to bring down his father's empire, and about the poor serving girl who had once been humiliated in the banquet hall and now turned out to be the spark that had set the whole collapse in motion. Harlan sat alone in the vast study, surrounded by news screens that kept broadcasting his face alongside words of condemnation, and for the first time in his life, the man who had once held power over the fates of so many others felt completely helpless, completely alone, completely abandoned by the very world he had spent his whole life climbing to the top of. When the door to the study swung open, he lifted his head, and there at the threshold stood Luke, calm and silent, his eyes looking straight at the father who was collapsing before him, with no hatred left in them, only the cold stillness of a man who had completed the thing he had pursued. "It was you," Harlan whispered, finally understanding, his face twisting with horror. "All this time, it was you." Luke did not answer at once. He only stepped into the room where his life had been torn down 6 years earlier, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a terrifying way, carrying the weight of all the lonely years that both he and Maeve had been forced to bear because of the ruthless pride of the man sitting before him. "I could have crushed you in many ways," Luke said, standing in the room that had once been the symbol of his father's power, now scattered with papers and swallowed by darkness. "I could have done it years ago, but I wanted you to watch everything collapse with your own eyes, one thing at a time, so you would understand what it feels like to lose everything you treasure, exactly the feeling you forced Maeve and me to carry for 6 years. Harlan looked up at his son, his mouth moving as if he meant to say something, perhaps a justification, perhaps a plea, but then he fell silent, because he realized there wasn't a word left in this world that could move the man standing before him, and that everything he had once used to control others, money, power, threats, had now become useless. Luke looked at his father for a long while longer, then turned and walked out, without a word of farewell, leaving Harlan sitting there among the ashes of the empire he had traded his own family to build. The weeks that followed passed like a flood, sweeping away the last remaining pieces of Harlan Voss's life. The corporation he had spent 30 years building officially filed for bankruptcy. The restaurants closed one after another. The signs bearing the Voss name that had once been his pride were quietly taken down, and the grand mansion where he had once hosted lavish parties was also put up for auction to repay his debts. Royce Bellamy, his ally in the darkness, had vanished completely from the world he had once longed to rule, stripped of all power and rejected by every faction, living the rest of his life like a drifting shadow with nowhere to belong, a living warning to anyone who dared betray. As for Eleanor, after raising her final voice to atone for her mistake, she quietly walked away from Harlan's marriage and Harlan's life, carrying with her the little peace she had found again after so many years of silence, leaving him utterly alone. And that loneliness, as it turned out, was the cruelest punishment that fell upon Harlan Voss, the man who had once been surrounded by hundreds of flatterers, who once only had to pick up a telephone to decide the fate of almost anyone, now sat alone in the shabby little house he had been forced to move into, without a friend, without family, without a single call, except reminders of debt. No one feared him anymore, and no one needed him anymore. In the thick silence of those endless days, he was forced to face himself, all the people he had trampled, the son he had cast aside, the innocent girl he had destroyed, and the bitter truth that every misfortune falling upon him now was the consequence of what his own hands had sown years earlier. He had once possessed everything a human being could desire: wealth, fame, power, and yet in the end, he had lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered: family and the human heart, simply because he had never learned that a person's worth does not lie in what they own. People said that in the months that followed, Harlan could sometimes be seen sitting quietly alone on a park bench, an old man with silver hair, watching the passing crowd with hollow eyes, with nothing left of the arrogant grandeur he had once carried. He did not seek out his son to beg forgiveness, because he knew there were wounds too deep to be mended, and mistakes too great to be redeemed by a few late apologies. He only sat there, facing the loneliness he had created with his own hands, learning a lesson he should have understood long ago, that the way a person treats those weaker than himself, in moments when he believes no one important is watching, is the truest measure of who he really is. And Harlan Voss, the man who had spent his whole life climbing to the summit of wealth, finally became the poorest man of all, because he had no one left to love, and no one left who loved him. A few weeks after the storm of public outrage settled, Maeve received a call from the hospital, but this time the voice on the other end of the line did not carry the cold detachment it had before. Instead, it brought news that made her sink into the nearest chair, both hands trembling around the phone. They told her that Wesley's spinal surgery had been scheduled again, that the leading surgeon from before had agreed to take the case, and that the entire cost, from the operation itself to the months of rehabilitation therapy afterward, had been fully paid by an anonymous benefactor. Maeve sat in silence for a long while, and though no one said the name aloud, she knew clearly in her heart who it was, because there was only one person in the world who understood what mattered most to her, and still had enough tenderness to help in a way that wouldn't wound her pride. She went to Luke that very evening, and just as she was about to speak, he shook his head softly, stopping her before she could say anything about money or gratitude. "You once said you didn't want to accept my help," Luke said, his voice gentler than it had ever been, and I respected that. "But this isn't me helping you, Maeve. This is me trying to repay a debt of tears that I've carried for 6 long years, a debt born from my own blindness and the cruel lies that tore us apart. When I saw you in that ballroom, standing frozen under the judgment of my father, my soul was consumed by bitterness and the ghost of a betrayal I thought was real. But then, as you turned to walk away into the dark rain, the light caught your face, the unforgettable profile I had carried in my memory for 6 long years. In that single, breathtaking second, the entire wall of ice around my heart shattered. My mind instantly raced back to the silver ring I knew you always wore close to your heart, and the promise we made. I knew right then, Maeve, that a woman who had sold out our love for a check would never have carried our memories into the rain. I knew you had kept it pressed against your chest, through thousands of grueling shifts, through hunger, and through every painful night, while I was busy nursing my hatred. In that exact moment, I knew you had never betrayed me. I knew you were the only one who had stayed true to our promise, while I was too blind to see the truth. I didn't pay for Wesley's surgery to be your savior. I did it because your loyalty is a treasure I am not worthy of, and tonight, I just want to begin earning my way back into your life." Maeve broke down in tears, because she never could have imagined that her quiet loyalty through the darkest years could echo so deeply and return to save her family at the very moment she needed it most. The day Wesley came home from the hospital after the successful surgery, the small apartment he shared with his sister was filled with a kind of light it had not known for a very long time, and though the road to recovery ahead was still long, for the first time in 5 years, his legs had begun to feel the first faint stirrings of sensation again, and in his eyes shone a clear, fragile hope. That evening, Wesley called his sister over to his easel, where he had finished a new painting he had kept hidden for days, and when he turned it around for her to see, Maeve went utterly still. In the painting was the image of a woman standing in the rain, her back straight and her chin lifted high, one hand shielding a small sapling rising from a crack in the stone, and behind her, the gloomy sky was slowly opening to reveal the first rays of sunlight. "This is you," Wesley said softly, his usual mischievous smile now mixed with a deep tenderness. "I painted you the way I've always seen you. No matter how hard the rain falls, you always stand strong and protect everything you love. You're the strongest person I've ever known." Maeve wrapped her arms around him and let the tears of happiness roll down her face, because to her, no fortune in the world could ever compare to that moment. When everything had passed, Luke offered to give her anything, a life free from worry, a place in his world of power. But once again, Maeve smiled and chose her own path. With the money she had saved and a small loan she took on herself, she opened a simple diner in the neighborhood where she had grown up. A warm place serving ordinary working people, where no one was judged by the clothes they wore or the work they did. She still wanted to build her life with her own hands. And Luke, the man who had once believed power was everything, now understood that true love was not about giving from above or possessing someone, but standing beside a person and honoring them for their own resilience. He often stopped by her diner in the late afternoons, sitting at the table near the window, quietly watching the woman he loved laugh and talk among her customers. And for the first time in his life, the man who had once known only hatred and loneliness finally found something that neither fortune nor power could ever buy: a home. 1 year after that fateful night in the Voss family's banquet hall, the lives of the people in this story had turned in completely different directions, each of them reaping exactly what they had sown. Maeve Donovan now stood behind the counter of the small diner she had built with her own hands, a place always warm with laughter and the smell of home-cooked food, where she treated every guest with the respect she herself had once longed to receive. And in those ordinary days, she found a complete happiness that no glittering empire could ever give her. Wesley, after months of patient therapy, was able to take his first steps with support, and he still worked beside his easel every day, his paintings now beginning to be known by more people, carrying the light of hope he had never once lost. Cora Whitley became the head chef and Maeve's companion at the new diner, finally doing the work she loved without having to bow her head before anyone. Luke, the man once known through fear, gradually let go of the shadowed world so he could learn how to live a decent life beside the woman he loved, proving that even a heart that seemed to have turned to stone could still be healed by kindness. As for Harlan Voss, he lived out the rest of his days in the loneliness he had created with his own hands, a quiet reminder to all of us of the true cost of arrogance. Their story leaves us with something simple yet profound, that the value of a human being is never measured by the money in their bank account or by the name they carry, but by the way they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. It reminds us that true integrity is not found in the power we wield over others, but in the compassion we choose to show when we have nothing to gain. And perhaps the most beautiful thing life teaches us is that kindness is never useless, because one small act that seems to have been forgotten can quietly travel a long way and return to us at the very moment we need it most, just as Maeve's love and loyalty from a rainy night returned to save her family many years later. And what about you? How do you feel about this story? About Maeve and Luke's journey? About the price Harlan had to pay for his arrogance? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always treasure and look forward to hearing every thought you have after each story. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear more meaningful and deeply moving stories. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May you and the people you love always be blessed with good health, and may you live a life full of